Section 16 of the Early Tudors by Charles Edward Moberly. This Librivox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 12. The Early Reformation Abroad, the Divorce, Fall of Wolsey, 1521 to 1530, Part 2. Through the greater part of July the cause dragged on, Campeggio getting constantly more and more unwilling to decide it, because the emperor's agents were constantly pressing the pope in opposition to Henry's wishes, and thus keeping him, as he said, between the hammer and the anvil. The 23rd of July, 1529, was at last appointed for the decision, and Henry was present to hear it. To his utter disgust, Campeggio only said that the Roman courts always had vacation from the end of July to the beginning of October, and that he must therefore adjourn the case till the next term began. As July was not yet over, this of course signified that the sentence, if given in London, would require a farther process at Rome, and it more than implied that the legatine court was now sitting for the last time, seeing that the revocation would certainly arrive before October. "No good ever came of cardinals in England," cried Suffolk with an oath. "You at least should not say so," rejoined Wolsey quietly, "for, cardinal as I am, your head would have fallen on the scaffold but for me." But in spite of this spirited reply, he knew well that the words just spoken by Campeggio were the signal for his destruction, and it was not long before the tempest was upon him. The attack took the strange form of a prosecution directed against him by royal permission in the Court of King's Bench for having exercised, in violation of the statute of 1395 already referred to, the legatine jurisdiction which Henry had invoked, and this involved a writ of praemunire with the forfeiture of all his property to the king. Nor was Henry restrained by any feelings of honour or delicacy from pressing his claim to the uttermost, though the case was much as if Charles I had of himself broken with Strafford and taken pains to get him prosecuted for the illegal things which they had done and planned together, or George III punished Lord North for his own obstinate enmity to America. The cardinal was ordered at once to give up the Great Seal, which passed much shorn of its power into the hands of Sir Thomas More. The Dukes of Norfolk and Suffolk, as president and vice-president of the council, were to do much of what had been Wolsey's work. His experience of his master induced him to submit at once and to sign a paper confessing that he had vexed many of the king's subjects by his proceedings as legate, and deserved to suffer imprisonment at the royal pleasure. He accordingly prayed Henry to take into his hands all his temporal possessions and benefices. His reason for thus abandoning all defence was, as he afterwards explained, that Henry, after once getting possession of his property, would do anything, however harsh, rather than resign it again. Consequently, even if he were acquitted on this charge, others would be brought against him, and if found guilty on any one of them, he would certainly be sentenced to perpetual imprisonment. Having arranged for the delivery to the royal officers of York Place, the modern Whitehall, and all that it contained, the cardinal went by water to Putney on the way to Esher, to which he had been ordered to withdraw, and thousands of boats thronged the river to see the outward signs of the great minister's fall. At Esher he remained almost destitute for some weeks, paying his servants' wages with money borrowed from his chaplains. But even while thus degraded and impoverished, he was hardly less formidable to his enemies than when his power was at the highest. So well known was his administrative talent that it hardly required Henry's frequent taunts as to the blundering way in which business was now done to make Norfolk and Suffolk apprehend that on the first great emergency he would be recalled to office and revenge himself on those who had ill-treated him. Accordingly, they fretted him continually with small affronts, hoping that he might thus be goaded to some unseemliness of language or action. Day by day he was either informed of some new charge against him or robbed of more property. We read with amazement that after having a cheering message which Henry sent him at Christmas, when he was seriously ill, the council persuaded the king that a gallery lately erected at Esher would be a suitable ornament for the palace at Westminster, and that accordingly the work was torn away before its owner's face. A bill was pressed on in Parliament making him incapable of serving the crown, but it fell through at the prorogation. The next best thing was to banish him as far as possible from Henry's presence, and with this object the council refused his request to be allowed to retire to Winchester, and insisted that he should go to York, the place from which he had his honour. Winchester was given to Gardiner, except a pension of £1,000 a year for Wolsey. At the same time the courtiers secured for themselves a number of assignments out of his other benefices, and the king tried very hard to manage that his pensions from foreign powers should for the future be paid to himself. On the 12th of February 1530 a formal pardon was given him, together with about £6,000 of his property. As soon as the roads were fit for travelling, he started for the north, April 15th, by way of Royston, Peterborough, and Southwell, the last a dependency on the See of York. Both on the way and during his short residence at Southwell, the goodwill of the gentry towards him was strongly manifested. Sir William Fitzwilliams, whom he had supported in a struggle against the Corporation of London, received him at his house near Peterborough with the most generous affection. In starting from Southwell he had to rise before day to escape from the friendliness of those who wished to lodge a great stag or twain for his amusement by the way. His first occupation on arriving at his own seat of Cawood Castle was to hold a confirmation of children, which he continued, like Woolston of old, till he almost dropped with exhaustion. He also succeeded in setting at rest a feud between two neighbouring gentry, expostulating not with them only, but with their turbulent retainers. He listened with kindness to the claim of the dean and canons that he should not enter the choir of York Minster till he was formally installed as archbishop, but directed that the ceremony should be less magnificent than they had intended, refusing in particular to have cloth laid down as usual from the city gate to the cathedral. Of all the trials inflicted on him, the hardest to bear was the treatment of his colleges. As he had founded them before the Premunire, the judges held unanimously that they had lapsed to the crown. Therefore the king confiscated the property of that at Ipswich, and seemed inclined to do the same with regard to Cardinal College or Christ Church, Oxford. For this noble foundation Wolsey pleaded in a tone which he had ceased to use for his own sake. About the same time the college authorities, on appealing to the king, were angrily reminded by him that several of their members had been against the divorce, and the Duke of Norfolk told them that their foundation would be dissolved and the buildings pulled down. However, they managed to avert the storm, fees to courtiers being, as they said in confidence, a chief means of effecting what they wished, and the king at last consented that Christ Church should retain a portion of its endowments. It was, he said, perhaps with more wisdom than is generally recognized, not for the welfare of the kingdom that it should be completed on the splendid scale planned by the cardinal. But before this matter was brought to a close, its great founder was dead. To understand the last events of his life it is necessary to go back a few weeks. Shortly after leaving Esher he had made a rash attempt through Du Bellay, the French ambassador, to secure the intercession of Francis I. His message to Du Bellay was sent by Agostino, an Italian physician in whom he had great confidence. But this man, having received from Norfolk a bribe of £100 to betray his master, revealed Wolsey's secret mission, which was interpreted into a wish to bring about political changes for his own interest. Nor were suspicions wanting that he was urging the Pope to excommunicate Henry unless he parted with Anne. Yet it may be questioned whether, according to the ideas of the time, what he had actually done would not have been held to justify the harshest measures. For the crime of asking for the intercession of a foreign prince was the same for which in 1456 Jacopo Foscari was racked at Venice 30 times in the presence of his aged father, the Doge. Intercession meant interference, and, as we shall see in another chapter, was considered a form of aggression. Cavendish gives a complete account of Wolsey's arrest, which he himself witnessed. It was effected by the young Earl of Northumberland, who had been brought up in his household, but had become his enemy on receiving a reprimand for misconduct in the north. Wolsey was not allowed to see the warrant. It contained, Northumberland said, secret matters which were not to be made known to him. On the next day the prisoner was sent southward under the care of Sir Roger Lascelles, the Earl remaining behind at Cawood to search for papers, and once more to take an inventory of his effects. At the end of the third day's journey the party reached Sheffield Park, where Lord Shrewsbury received the Cardinal with great respect, and tried to persuade him that the king would certainly comply with his request and give him a personal hearing. But on learning that Sir W. Kingston, the lieutenant of the Tower, had come to take charge of him, Wolsey thought the very name so ominous as to outweigh all the Earl's encouragements. "I perceive," he said, "more than you can imagine or know. Experience of old hath taught me." Nor was he more cheered when Kingston told him of the king's belief that he would clear himself of all charges. Such comfortable words were intended only to bring him into a fool's paradise. Meantime a dysentery had been coming on, and his strength was failing. Yet he held on for 3 days longer, and by way of Hardwicke Hall and Nottingham arrived at Leicester Abbey. On the next morning Kingston found him too weak to be questioned, according to orders, about a sum of £1,500, which should have been at Cawood, but had not been found. Henry being concerned that the money should be embezzled away from both of us. In the course of the same day occurred the celebrated conversation with Sir W. Kingston, containing a character of Henry VIII, of which every true history of the reign must be an expansion. He is a prince of royal courage, and hath a princely heart, and rather than he will miss or want part of his appetite, he will hazard the loss of 1/2 of his kingdom. I assure you I have often kneeled before him in his privy chamber the space of an hour or 2 to persuade him from his will and appetite, but I could never dissuade him. Sad to relate, Wolsey's last message to his master contained an earnest entreaty that he would have a vigilant eye upon this new pernicious sect of Lutherans, which, if allowed to grow up unheeded, might enact over again in England the horrors of the Hussite war in Bohemia. His whole administration, like that of Richelieu in after time, had been marked by a scornful neglect of merely theological questions. At this supreme moment worldliness resigned its sway, yet in favour, alas, not of true religion, but of the persecuting spirit. Had he lived longer to carry out such views of the religious life, all England might have had cause to regret the day when he began to serve God as faithfully as he had served his king. He died on the 29th November 1529, just as the clock struck 8, the very hour which he had foretold would be his last. Within a week of Wolsey's condemnation by the Court of King's Bench met the celebrated Reformation Parliament of 1529. Unlike its forerunners in the reign, it was to be carried on in successive sessions till 1536, because, being made up entirely of the king's servants, it was ready implicitly to follow his lead against the clerical body, which had as a whole been opposed to the divorce. The House of Commons began, evidently according to arrangement, with a petition complaining that convocation often made, without reference to the Crown or to any civil authority, laws and ordinances against the king's prerogative, as well as vexatious and oppressive to the people. Among the resulting grievances they mentioned the long journeys which had to be made by persons cited to the archbishop's courts, the money often charged for the administration of the sacraments, the vexations of summoners and informers, the questions asked in the church courts to entrap people into heresy, and the abuse of conferring benefices on children. This paper Henry sent to Archbishop Warham, calling on him for a reply, and at the same time directing Parliament to prepare bills remedying the grievances of which they complained. After laying the paper before the bishops, Warham made a singular reply in their name. They made laws, he said, only according to the warrant of Holy Scripture and the Catholic Church. Consequently, it would be only right that the king should temper his own laws into conformity with these. Although, he continues, we may not submit the execution of our duty prescribed to us by God to your Highness's assent, yet we most humbly desire your grace to show your mind and opinion to us, which we shall most gladly hear and follow, if it shall please God to inspire us to do so. This meant in brief that the clergy legislated in religious matters, though the civil power might advise them, a view which did not show any profound knowledge of English constitutional precedents. The archbishop laid down in the later paragraphs of his answer that open penance for sin may rightly be commuted for money where it is desirable to maintain the party's good fame, that severity must be used to repress the beginnings of Lutheranism in England, that witnesses even of bad character should be received in such prosecutions if their tale is likely, that the jurisdiction of the archbishops had been exercised for centuries and ought to be so still, in spite of the inconveniences to those cited out of the diocese in which they lived, and that when a quite young person is appointed to a benefice, its income may properly be spent on his education. Such an answer proved that the clerical mind was running in a groove of its own, and unlikely to understand the statesman's view of things, especially when it was considered what kind of a comment upon the archbishop's principles was furnished by familiar aspects of church rule. Here an ignoble squabble about the coverlet of a man just dead, there an arbitrary increase of tithes, elsewhere a fine of a few shillings inflicted on a clergyman as sufficient punishment for a grave delinquency, so that, as Warham himself complains, priests were hooted in the streets or knocked into the kennel. Obviously, therefore, no question more required settlement than whether church or state law was to be supreme, and this was soon decided by a stratagem which in a moment turned the defences of the ecclesiastics, suggested, as it is said, by Cromwell, a servant of Wolsey's, who after his fall had become the king's secretary, having earned golden opinions by his bold defence of his master in Parliament. Henry suddenly announced that the whole body of the clergy had subjected themselves to praemunire, with its two consequences of imprisonment and forfeiture of goods, by acknowledging Wolsey's legatine jurisdiction. They might reply that they had done so only as all England had, and as the king had ordered them. Indeed, it seems strange that a body of men not wanting in spirit failed to see that consequences could not easily be enforced against them if they showed an even front and stated their case well. As it was, the audacity of the charge seemed to strike Convocation with a kind of panic, and they consented to pay £119,000 as a fine for their misdemeanour. But over and above this they were, under the same penalty, to acknowledge the king's supremacy in church affairs, which would plainly involve the abandonment of their claim to make canons without his permission. Convocation voted the subsidy on the 24th of January, 1531, and a fortnight later the king was most reluctantly recognized as the singular protector and only supreme governor of the English Church, and, as far as the law of Christ permits, its supreme head. On the 13th of May, 1532, they agreed for themselves and their successors to frame no new canons without the royal license, and farther consented that whatever in the existing body of church law appeared not to stand with God's law should be abrogated by the united action of king and clergy. For the present, nothing was expressly said about the power of the Pope, inasmuch as Clement might possibly still decide on the marriage as the king wished. The act of convocation was not quite unresisted by the general body of the clergy. As to the fine, they vainly argued that it ought to be paid only by those who had done things really acknowledging the legatine jurisdiction, that is, only by the bishops and superior clergy, and on the other point a protest was numerously signed against any interference with church liberties or the Pope's authority. At Rome itself the enforced submission of the Church was treated as a revolt on Henry's part. Therefore all delays were put aside, and he was informed, May 31st, 1531, that the revoked cause would at once be reopened there, and that the court would proceed to a decision whether he appeared or no. Before the session of 1529-1530 ended, Parliament passed bills for the reduction of the probate duty and the partial abolition of mortuaries, that is, of the offensive perquisites claimed by the clergy on the death of a parishioner. Another bill was to restrain clerical trading and farming, with pluralities and non-residents, but this was shown to press so hard upon many of the poorer incumbents that it was passed only in a mitigated form. Such was the first session of the celebrated Parliament of 1529, which was to be continued session after session till 1536, ready to pass, suspend, or recall measures according to the royal word of command, yet on the whole deserving our gratitude for much of the work which it accomplished. For the evil attending its measures at the time has long been purged away from Church and State, while the good has grown with our growth and strengthened with our strength. End of section 16.